Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Welcome. This is Natasha Helfer. And welcome, Allan and Michelle. We are super excited for today's topic. Today's topic is men. People who've been raised as men, people who've been socialized as men, people who identify as men, whatever that means to you. And what I thought I'd start out with is, I have considered myself a feminist for pretty much since I was, probably late adolescence, and definitely have, expanded that throughout my career and my journey in Mormonism and all of that. And I got this message yesterday, and it really meant a lot to me. So this person said, I'm binging old John Larson episodes, which if you know what that means, then you've been in the blogosphere and in the podcast world for a long time, and I'm impressed. So I'm binging old John Larson episodes, and you were preaching truth about sexuality all the way back in 2010, which is true. Thank you especially for being an advocate for male sexuality as a female voice. As a girl dad, I try to be an extreme advocate for women, but there seems to be so few female voices zealously advocating for men. Thank you for helping me love myself. There were many times that your words specifically saved me unaliving myself during my transition. Thank you. Be safe, happy, and healthy. So thank you for the person who, left me this message. That was very kind feedback. And it's true. I've been passionate about, all kinds of sexual health for a long time. But I'm a lover of men. I'm a straight heterosexual woman. I love having sex with men. I have birthed men. I love men. I have 3 boys of my own. And as a feminist, it's always interesting to see the advocacy of both female bodies and male bodies from that lens. And I've seen and studied quite a bit of male toxicity and how we've socialized men in particular to be so emotionally bereft of resources, emotional resources and emotional capacity in their own bodies, in their own expressions, and then leaving them, in spaces where they're not as attuned and as equipped to have a relational success than later on. So that's our topic for today. And I'm excited to dive in. Yes, I'm just going to open up the sphere, and maybe Allan, you want to get us started on kind of your thoughts in general about this topic?
Well, as somebody that was enculturated with the whole male range of emotion that we're allowed to have, which I refer to men as having a 3-speed transmission when it comes to emotions, where we can be mad, sad, or glad, and that's pretty much it. But there's a million words and nuances to our emotional landscape. And we've just been denied the ability to develop that emotional muscle. If you think of emotion as a muscle, ours is pretty atrophied. It hasn't had the workouts it deserves. And it can really help deepen the conversation with family, friends, and partners. And that can really, really help when it comes to the whole realm of our relations with others. And men have been cheated, and that makes me mad. And I want to do something about it. So, in the next year, look forward to, a group about building emotional muscle for men. They really need that help and they deserve it.
I love that. And I love how, we can lean into kind of that language that we a lot of times expect men to talk in that language, right? Of muscles and strength and aggression. And so we're leaning into that because I think that makes it more palatable, and it helps people feel like there's less shame about it, right? Sometimes if we don't, it can feel like off-putting in some ways. But Michelle, what are your thoughts? Especially because I know that from your background, the little I know about your background, especially in your graduate studies, which has been fairly recent, is that there has been a lot of gender kind of background in your studies. And I think that that was an interest, especially in your cohort. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the things that you're coming out of your training in regards to all of these stereotypes and things that you were studying?
Absolutely. It's been interesting because something I always bring up is how we're changing as generations are kind of passing by, right? And the things that we focus on and the stereotypes that we have about gender are changing so rapidly. And so a lot of times when I hear, about, men are socialized to think that emotion is, a sign of weakness. And I think about these generations that are kind of now coming into adulthood, they are often not being raised on those same ideas as intensely. It's still very much there because patriarchy is still alive and well in the world. But you see men or people who are being raised as men who are being taught, let's actually talk about emotions and let's not actually just treat you like somebody who needs to tough it out and allow the women to kind of use that emotional language. And so it was interesting. I worked last year at the University of Utah's Counseling Center, and to see some of the men there who were coming into therapy at higher rates and kind of those rates are approaching those of women, I think is kind of speaking to this idea that men are now finally starting to get afforded the opportunity to talk about their emotions in ways that past generations never really were given. And so that's been a great thing to see, as I think we have more access as well to resources like individualized therapy, but also group therapy. I think we're going to see men kind of look to other men and say, oh, wow, you're talking about your emotions. Okay, this is great. Okay, then maybe I can actually talk about mine.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I'm running a male sexual shame recovery group, and this is something that gets repeated almost every week. They'll say things like, it's so nice to be in a group of men where we can share these ideas and thoughts and feelings and not feel alone and have other men share the same things that I've been thinking. And where else do we get to talk about this with other men, And so they're constantly saying things like that. And so one of the things that I notice a lot when I see couples coming in, Gary Chapman's book, The 5 Love Languages, it's a very popular kind of pop psychology type of book, although he's not a psychologist. I just want to point that out. So it's just kind of one of those kind of, fad type of ideas. And it's not evidence or research based, but I think it just gives people some language to kind of have that sense of, what matters to you and what matters to me. And I'd say about 90% of the time when couples come in, and I would say, I work primarily with white, heterosexual, cisgender, fairly, kind of middle to high social upper class couples, post-Mormon. So that's kind of the people I'm talking about, above the age of 40. Okay, so we're talking about that kind of level. The men in those relationships will say something along the lines of, well, my primary love language is touch. And like, that's a big revelation, like I'm supposed to be really surprised by that, and like 90% of them are saying this. and I'm like, well, duh. The reason I'm saying duh is because, again, when I'm thinking about the cultural context of that and how somebody above the age of 40 was socialized, back in the day, and having, because I'm in that age range, and having seen my peers treated and how they were, we grew up with all of those messages of don't act like a girl, don't be like a girl, don't cry like a girl, don't emote like a girl, don't throw a ball like a girl, all of those things. The only ways that if I'm going to sweep with wide brushes, that boys got to, first of all, feel and or have physical contact with anybody, which we know touch is important, was through football or sex. I mean, that was kind of how you got your feelings met, your emotional needs met if you were a young man. And when you look historically, like way in the past, outside of American homophobia, boys and men actually got to touch quite a bit. They got to hold hands, they got to hug, they got to be in close contact with one another without that being sexualized, without that meaning much of anything. But in this very homophobic culture that's been around since probably the 1930s or 40s or definitely 50s, that's been, really ripped away from people who've been socialized as boys. So you have a segment of the population who's like touch starved, who's in a sense emotionally starved, although they do live in patriarchy and have privileges in that sense. In a way, if you're raised as a female in our society, in my age group anyway, we were able to touch each other. We were able to talk and cry together and in recess and have our little social groups and emote quite a bit and even touch each other quite a bit and hug each other and have sleepovers and lie next to each other without really much of anything in regards to being concerned about being considered, sexualized in that regard. Maybe a little bit, with the whole stereotypical like lesbian fetishizement of pillow parties or whatever. But in general, we were allowed to do those things by the society. So I think a lot of times in marriage, in traditional heterosexual marriage, what is happening is that men are looking to their heterosexual wife, kind of desperate for this connection through sex and touch as their way to get those needs met in ways that then can come across as very pressure filled and almost kind of in an immature way that isn't necessarily about negotiation and or meeting kind of an egalitarian negotiated way. You add a high demand religion to that. You add a lot of cultural context to that. You add the fact that most of us don't know how to talk about sex or relationships anyway. And now you have a little bit of a recipe for disaster. Any thoughts? What do I have wrong or right about my sweeping wide brushes disaster stereotype here?
Something I was going to add about your idea of, that men get touch, from, high contact sports or from sex is what's interesting is if you go to a lot of other different countries, like I'm thinking about an experience I had where I was in Haiti several years back, and you do see the men holding hands with other men, right? Or, I even saw like one man brushing his brother's hair before church on Sunday, and these are patriarchal systems as well. And they're highly religious and highly conservative, and yet still don't have that same sexualization of man-to-man contact that we seem to have here in the States. And so it almost makes me wonder if there's something even beyond, patriarchy and beyond, I don't know, whatever it is here in this country that makes us really think that touch is so sexual, or that it's really easy to label things as sexual or just odd, that a lot of other countries don't have, which may be wrapped up in just the relationship that Americans have in general with touch and how, I don't know, just standoffish sometimes we can be.
Well, and going back to, love language being touch for men, there's always two sides to that coin, that fence, however you want to visualize it. On the one side, if they're saying my love language is touch, on the other side, they're saying, I don't have the emotional language for that to become part of my intimacy, for part of my intimate repertoire. I can't get my needs fulfilled through language, through the intimacy of an emotional language with my partner. And to me, that's what kind of makes me mad. And it's like, because they deserve that. Intimacy occurs on so many different levels, and to confine it to touch is really selling men short. And I just, there's a cost to patriarchy for men and women. Men don't pay near the price as women do, but it's still, it represses them. It confines them into these boxes that humanity does not belong in. It's just not human to be in that box. And we've constrained it based on sex. And it's bizarre. It's not healthy. It's not normal. We've made it the norm, but that's a cultural norm. That's not a humanity norm. You know, I have a hobby where I collect old black and white photographs of men in groups. And because what they do is you can see that during the turn of the century, from some of the earliest photography in the late 1800s, all through the teens, 20s, 30s, men were much more physically intimate with each other in group situations than they are now. And there's been this shift of not allowing men to express themselves even physically with each other anymore. You can't just give a guy a hug or anything. It's changing with the younger generations. And I love that you bring that up, Michelle, because I'm noticing it too. For the younger clients, this is not as big of an issue. But with that generation, that older generation, I would say probably from the 40s and up, these men really have been left in an emotional void when it comes to being able to express themselves. And that's something that doesn't have to stand. It really shouldn't stand. We shouldn't accept it. And then pathologize culturally, pathologize men's touch as somehow being homoerotic or, something like that, does them a further disservice, because what it does is that buys into all of those stereotypical pressures and put downs and constraints of, don't be like a girl, don't be like this. And even my own training, which is not as recent as Michelle's, there were still stereotypes I was hearing, even at the graduate level, that men bond through action, whereas women tend and befriend. So the whole, women are much more nurturing, women can have these emotional connections, women can have all this language and talk, but men, we're going to be quiet and we're just going to go do something. We're just going to play a contact sport, or we're going to shoot hoops, or we're going to fix a car, or we're going to, whatever. That's how men bond. And I think we're really selling men short when we buy into that and we uphold that.
Well, and we know through so much of the current research that there is no statistical difference between the emotional needs of male bodies and female bodies. There's no emotional statistical difference. And then on top of that, we also know that gender is a cultural construct, right? So however feminine you feel or masculine you feel, a lot of that is just how we've been socialized. And, your sex is your body parts and maybe somewhat of your hormonal structure, but a lot of your gender is all of these messages we've received. And so the more comfortable the younger generations are getting with gender fluidity, non-binary kind of constructs, you see more permission for those things to not be as rigidly set, which I think is a great, it's going to be really interesting, I think, to see what happens in the next 20 years in regards to how that affects relationships, research, et cetera. Because, it's interesting, like you said, Allan, when we study this research and how they'll talk about, well, men do this and women do this, but I'm always like, but do they really? Because, or is that just how we've socialized men and women to do certain things, but it's not necessarily the box that they'll necessarily stay in. So exactly. I agree with that. And then to Michelle's point, it's interesting, as you were talking about touch, and again, these men who will come in and say, well, touch is my, my language of choice, my love language of choice. But then I'll have the women say, well, wait a minute, touch is my language too. It's just, it just doesn't involve a penis and a vagina touch. What about cuddling touch? What about, like kissing touch? What about, like some of this other kind of touch that I really enjoy with you, but it doesn't necessarily lead to intercourse, right? So even when we talk about touch, what does that actually mean? Does that mean sex to the point of completion and ejaculation and orgasm? Or does that mean touch in the sense of cuddling up together and enjoying skin to skin contact. So that's something that we're always exploring, in couples therapy as well, and how we don't want to have touch just mean a certain thing. But again, in the language of male socialization, I think it has been that touch means, especially, if you're a stud, if you're a man, it's all about the conquest. It's about the sexual conquest, and it's about the completion of sexuality being orgasm, being ejaculation. So that's concerning too, that there's a lot of different types of touch that can be very pleasant and pleasurable. It doesn't have to mean this one thing.
Well, let's go back to a point you made. It's that as human beings, we all come with standard equipment, emotional equipment. It's standard equipment. It's included. It's just that we don't use it as men. We're not socialized to use it. It's there. It's for us. They serve a function and a purpose. And it's a great source of information. And if you don't have that information, then you're really being cheated out of having deeper, more emotional conversations with those that you're connected to. And it leaves you kind of handicapped in the realm of being able to express yourself fully. Men find other ways of doing that. And again, they've been socialized to believe that actions speak louder than words when it comes to men. And that's not true. It can be true, but it's not true always. So developing the emotional muscle, as I call it, it starts with basically, number one, we're going to start with anger, because that's the most problematic go-to emotion for men. And anger, I can't tell you how often I engage with men, and what they really want a handle on is their anger, their irritability, and how that affects their relationships. And we all know anger is a secondary emotion. It's an emotion that comes out when other emotions are frustrated from being fully expressed. And if you don't have the language, how do you express that? Anger, not always, but mostly, is a secondary emotion. And we're going to go down to what are the primary emotions? And how do we access those? What are the words for these? And what we're going to do is we're going to use that to develop emotional language and expression in furtherance of being able to deepen the conversations with people they care about and people they're attached to.
I love that. And I think that will be just such a useful thing for people to tap into, for sure. Michelle, any last thoughts in regards to this topic as we close up today?
Yeah, Allan, I love that that's what you're starting with, because I remember when I first learned about how, men, anger is basically the only emotion that that is socially acceptable for them to feel. It makes a whole lot of sense then that we see in our society that that's how they emote, and we see it in very extreme cases of violence, right? So to be able to start there and look at, okay, why are you angry? And let's actually broaden the language around that. What I've seen in my practice is when I have a male client come in, you can tell that they're feeling a lot of emotions, and usually anger is the one they go to and can kind of pinpoint and talk about. But a lot of times they have a hard time kind of parsing that out and figuring out, okay, well, why am I angry? And so I love, introducing them to things like the feel wheel, or just even lists of emotions to kind of be like, look through these. What else are you maybe feeling there? And they're like, oh, well, actually this as well. Oh, and this and this. I'm like, okay. So anger isn't this like monolithic thing that's just like, that's all you're feeling. And there's just like rage bubbling up within you. And that's what you walk around with all day. You are a far more complex being who is capable of feeling all these other things. And sometimes just giving the language or sitting in a group with other people who are using other words can really empower you, because we don't know what emotions we're feeling if we don't have the words for them. We're just kind of like, it's just kind of there and it's impacting me and I'm reacting out of it. And so again, I'm really excited for this group, and I think it's going to benefit a lot of people just to be able to see what other people are experiencing and what words they're putting to that, because sometimes we can really come to understand ourselves through seeing other people and how they're expressing as well. So
Yeah, and the power of seeing that you're not alone is marvelous and instrumental, especially when it comes to emotional things for men, because it's a vulnerable space. But if they see that they're not alone and that they're not the only one going through it, that really, really helps.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. I'm thinking about the book Boys and Sex by Peggy Ornstein. She also wrote the book Girls and Sex. And that was a really interesting read in regards to, again, not making assumptions that, boys, all they want is sex and all they want is, these conquests. What we're really understanding as we start interviewing young men is that they're desperate for connection. They're desperate for a relationship. They're lonely, they're isolated often. Again, women and men, those are two very binary words. People want love. They want connection. And we're not that different, regardless of our anatomy, regardless of our gender. And emotional intelligence is the tool that gets us most of what we want. And we're not born with emotional intelligence, people. We're not. Most of us are not born with those skills. Some of us are more privileged with emotional intelligence if you happen to be born into a system or family that happens to have better emotional skills than other systems or families. And my experience is that most systems and families are not that great at it. So we're just not. So our primary instincts, which are survival instincts, the fight, flight, freeze instincts, they're not emotionally intelligent instincts. They're great for fighting off bears and saber-toothed tigers and climbing trees. They're not really great for having relationships. Those are emotional regulation and intelligence skills, and those are primarily learned. They're not natural. So we all need help with these. I think people who've been socialized as men in particular need help because society has put you at a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
So we hope that you have a great weekend on this December 10th, 2021 weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst touch the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous way, obey thy will.
Obey thy will.
When thou sayest to them,
Be still.
wondrous song
Savior, pilot me.
When at last I near the shore and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say,